Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Women in Leadership Talk podcast. Thank you so much, Sara Taylor, for joining us today, all the way from Minneapolis. So thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Vicki. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, we're thrilled to have you, and I'm excited to really jump into our conversation today because, the work that you're doing has a lot of impact with organizations. And so I'm excited for our audience to learn more about you and the work that you've been doing for, many years now, 20 some years you've been focused on this. But before we get there, let me just welcome our audience. Thank you so much for being here today. Joining in on podcasts, there are thousands and thousands of them now. And we're super grateful that you continue to listen to us and share the messages of the incredible individuals that come on the Will Talk podcast and share their stories and journeys. And our hopes is that you'll walk away today with something that you cannot unlearn what you learn. So we're thrilled to have you here. So thank you. And let me just give you a little bit of feedback about Sara so that you understand why we've invited her to be a guest today. So she is a diversity and inclusion strategist, renowned for her visionary work in culture competence. She's a nationally recognized speaker, best-selling author, and she's dedicated to changing the world through the workplace by making organizations across the globe more effective and inclusive, and their leaders more culturally competent. I so love that. Love that. She
Thank you.
founded Deep Sea Consulting in 2002 to provide insightful consulting and strategic diversity training paired with measurement tools to build individual and organizational cultural competence. So Sara just launched her latest book just this past summer. And that book is Thinking at the Speed of Bias. So how to shift our unconscious filters. And so I'm thrilled to jump in and learn more about your story, Sara. And maybe if you can, start off by sharing with our audience, like what even led you to this focus 20 some years ago. So give us the background.
Well, and actually, it was much longer ago than just 20 years. 22 years ago is when I started my company. But I have been a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner for 35 years
Wow.
now. It's funny, I just recently had mentioned that, or that was in a bio, and a participant in one of the programs said, I didn't even know this work was around for that long.
Yeah,
That's the
exactly.
kind of feedback that you get when you've been in this field for so long. And and some folks, those that are listening, what you don't know is that I am a white woman, middle-aged. And you might be surprised, what's a white woman doing as a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner? But honestly, while for 35 years I've been a practitioner, even before then, honestly, since I was in middle school, we called it junior high. I have been giving speeches and presentations about stereotypes, discrimination, and how we see difference. So, even from an early age, this has been a passion of mine.
Amazing. Amazing. So the work that you're doing, like this is really key to, changing dynamics of, systems and hierarchies and all the things that, people get frustrated with and feel marginalized from. And so what really has been the essence of the things you see happening as it relates to bias?
Mm. We see so much. We see it from all levels, from the broad system level. And this is, I'm sure, what a lot of folks recognize as well, the broad systemic disparities in any sector, any system, from graduation rates in the and so many more in education, to health disparities in healthcare, to the wealth gap in economics. So over and over again. Then you bring that down to our local structures, if you will, in our organizations, the companies we're a part of, the organizations, the communities, where we see is a lack of equity in organizations and a lack of representation in leadership in particular. And that is fueled by bias. Now, sometimes can that be fueled by intentional discrimination and intentional uh, advantage creating, disadvantage creating? Absolutely. But my focus is really on that unintentional because that's so much more difficult. One of
Yeah.
the things that we know from a particular cultural competence assessment is that almost 99% of us overestimate our effectiveness in our ability to check and challenge our unconscious
Mm.
bias. We
Wow.
think we're so much more competent than we actually are. That's what gets at that positive intent, not intentional discrimination in this case. And that's why it's so much more difficult for folks to first identify and accept, wow, this is coming from me, even with my positive intent. Even though I'm trying to be respectful, I'm trying to address disparities and create inclusion, it's coming from me. So that's why it's so much more difficult.
Yeah, that opens up a whole can of worms.
Mhm.
Like I used to just thinking back to, just one example of that was the George Floyd incident that took place.
Mhm.
And one of my women that come into the Women in Leadership Empowered, I'd said to her, like, could you just come in and talk about, she happened to be Black, Caribbean, Jewish young woman, super smart. And I said, would you come in and just talk about, these discrimination and the things that are happening? And it was so fascinating to what you just said, because the question she asked me, Sarah, I'll never forget this. She said, Vicki, who is your friend group? Who's your
Mhm.
circle? And I went, what?
Mhm.
And she said, I just want to understand, who are the people you surround yourself with?
Mhm.
And so I started telling her, and actually one of my dearest friends happens to be a Black Jamaican man. But we were talking about, and she goes, okay, because I don't want to be your one token
Mhm.
Black friend. And I
Mhm.
was like, wow, like I never even thought about it that way. Right.
Mhm.
And so to your point, my intent was positive because I wanted to educate people on why there's these biases that are happening, intentional
Mhm.
or not intentional. So
Mhm.
so how do we, well, let me say this. Congratulations on your book.
Thank
I've
you.
not had a chance to read it yet, but I will be reading it. And, from what you've shared, like one of the things I heard you say was 60% of employees believe that their workplace is biased. And so where is that, does that follow suit with the unintentional or the unawareness that we have?
Absolutely. There are organizations that create intentional uh barriers, if you will, but that actually is pretty rare. The majority of organizations are unintentionally creating what I call filter driven policies, practices, expectations with the best of intentions, not understanding how those will continue to perpetuate inequity and exclusion.
Mhm. Give us an example, Sarah, of something you've seen, just more of a general, but I know what you're saying is true because I've heard that even from the lens of trust, right?
Mhm.
Like policies get created that actually are counter to what you say you're trying to create. So maybe
Mhm.
just share an example of how you see that.
Mhm. One that is common that folks might think, well, how would this relate to disparities? And that is communication policies.
Mm-hmm.
Communication policies that I review when folks say, hey, we want to make sure our policies are equitable. Communication policies almost always are the ones that are glaringly inequitable
Mm-hmm.
because they institute and perpetuate and reinforce only the dominant culture way of communicating.
Mm.
And what is that cult? Where is that coming from? That particular norm of communication? It's coming from patterns in unconscious filters. So I want to talk about filters just a bit before I keep explaining a little bit more of those communication styles. So I coined the terms, this has been over a decade ago now, frames and filters to talk about both the differences in our identities and how we take in differences. So
Okay.
frames are the differences that we can easily see that we're conscious of. Folks that are watching the video can see that I'm a white woman, I'm middle-aged, 57 to be exact. If I were to stand up next to a yardstick, you'd see that I'm 5'7". You see my mannerisms, but there's not a whole lot more that you see just on the surface.
Mm.
The much more complex and much more numerous differences come from our filters that
Mhm.
create our perceptions, our preferences, and also create our judgments of others.
Mm.
So our filters take in exponentially more information than we can ever be conscious of. In fact, let me get at that with a question. I want to just pause after I ask the question and see if folks can think about it a bit. How many pieces of information do you think our brains take in just 1 second? What do you think?
Hundreds, like probably thousands.
Actually, try millions, 11 million.
Wow. Wow, really?
And that just seems impossible to imagine, right? And the
Yeah.
reason is because we think about that with our conscious mind, and
Mm.
consciously, we're only taking in 40.
Mm-hmm.
So, what does that mean? Every second, 10,999,960 pieces of information are getting absorbed by our unconscious filters operating to with that intention, absorbing information, then using that information on a moment by moment basis to create our decisions. Just
Mm-hmm.
think about that one for a bit. What's your next thought going to be? You can't say, right? We
Right.
don't know
Yeah.
what our next thought is. And we know this from brain researcher Benjamin Libet because that thought comes from our unconscious.
Wow.
And what creates it? Our filters. So it's really our filters that are in control, absorbing information, categorizing it, using it to create our thoughts.
Mm.
In our filters are stored norms from the groups that we've been a part of, for one thing. And so let's go back to that communication styles. If I've been a part of a group that communicates in one particular way, I learned it as I was growing up. I learned it in, the community that I was in. I learned it in school and, over and over and over again, right? But yet I don't realize. And so my filters are saying this is the right way to communicate. This is the professional way, the good way, the respectful way. What my filters don't tell me is, oh my gosh, that's actually only one of several ways
Mm-hmm.
because they don't know that. So when we come into the workplace, then with different filter preferences for how we communicate, if our policies reflect only the communication styles that come from the dominant culture, well, then what happens to those that have different filter preferences?
Yeah.
Oh, they just aren't really that respectful when they communicate. They're just so emotional or they're just so evasive, all kinds of labels that we put on them. In actuality, it's just a different communication style.
Sure. Sure. That's a great example. I love how you explain that because that's where all the interpretations come in, assumptions
Mhm.
are made.
Mhm.
And that's how things get derailed, right?
Mhm.
Because somebody thinks that somebody means something completely different. The intent is not always understood. So how do you help individuals or organizations start to shift that
Mhm.
communication style to be more inclusive and take in the diverse in thought, culture, religion, gender, everything that has to be included.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, we really have to fully understand our filters first. They really are what's in control.
Right.
And we have to understand, I kind of went through real quickly the three functions. Take in information outside of our conscious awareness. And I want to just take a little bit of a tangent there. Think about that. How many seconds have I been awake already today? I
Mhm.
don't even know. So, how many pieces of information could I have taken in that are actually, I don't consciously believe,
Yeah.
I consciously disagree with?
Mhm.
Information that may tell me, Sarah, you shouldn't be in the workplace. You should be at home. You definitely shouldn't be a leader because you're a woman, as an example. So, our filters are first taking in exponentially more information than we are consciously aware of. They sort that information and use it to decide our thoughts, our preferences, our perceptions,
Mhm.
which in turn create our behaviors. So, what we first need to do is understand that. We
Mhm.
need to understand that when we are focusing on behaviors and we say to folks in an organization, you know, stop doing that. Don't do that behavior, do this behavior. We're focusing on the symptom and not the source.
Mhm.
If you think about and we see organizations do this all the time. So we can go back to communication styles. Um, and I literally just had a coaching session with an executive who happens to come from another country. He is a person of color. His communication style is very emotionally expressive.
Mhm.
And in the dominant US of emotionally restrained, he was continually getting you just need to tone it down. You're just too expressive. And even basically saying, we're not really going to be able to continue to advance you because of this communication stuff, right?
Mhm.
So the organization is focused on that behavior. That behavior is wrong. And they're ready to say, hey, you're out of here because of this behavior. But what creates our behavior that is visible? A conscious thought. And
Yeah.
what do we know already? What creates our conscious thought? An unconscious filter. So
Right.
if you want to understand the behaviors in an organization, you got to go all the way back to the filters that create them.
Right.
And if we are only allowing for this behavior, this kind of communication style, again, as an example, then we're only allowing for a small portion of the population as
Sure.
a resource for us,
Yeah.
essentially for our organization.
Wow. Wow. That's fascinating, actually. Just even how you brought that full circle, right?
Mhm.
Like when you think about that, because it goes back to the if you're not like us,
Yeah.
then you get excluded, right?
Hmm.
And so that's a that's a tough machine to turn around
It
and
is.
help organizations even see
Hmm.
that that's happening. Um, and trying to sway people to your beliefs, right? Like
Hmm.
that can do a lot of damage and isolates a whole nother segment of our population.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's really important to keep in mind is that interplay between frames and filters as others are judging us.
Yeah.
So they see that behavior, but what we know also is that when folks are seeing a particular behavior, that their filters are saying, "Ooh, that's disrespectful,"
Mhm.
they're more ready to disregard, that negative judgment on the person if the
Mhm.
person is more like them. But if
Mhm.
the person is a different
Point.
identity, a frame that we see is very different from us,
Hmm.
then it's much easier for that filter to attach that judgment to the frame, to the
Got it.
person as a whole, and even to that whole identity group. So instead of that behavior is rude, it's that person is
Person.
rude, and even that whole group is rude.
Yeah.
That's what can link into then the continuing the systemic advantage, the systemic inequities.
Wow. Yeah, that is so fascinating. And you're absolutely right. And then you have a visual, right? That visual. And then so when someone else comes into your space and they behave that way, you automatically put that filter on them that that's who they behave like, and that so therefore here's my judgment to that.
Mm-hmm,
Wow. Okay. So again, like we are so ingrained with our
mm-hmm,
beliefs, right? And we
mm-hmm,
only know what we know.
mm-hmm,
So how
mm-hmm.
do you start to step out of that and
Right.
yeah, and we could use a number of examples. So talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I know how filters work, let's think about those steps again. So filters create thoughts, which create behaviors, right?
Mhm.
Think about each one of those, really the power of filters, right? And each one of those steps. Of any of those steps, only one can be missing in any given interaction,
Mhm.
and that's the conscious thought. Our
Mhm.
filters are so powerful that they directly can create behaviors.
Right.
And so, what we need to do to intervene is before the filter create is as the filter is creating the thought before we get to a behavior. And this ties again to those three functions. I can't really, I can't control. Yes, I can take in positive inputs, but I can't control that 11 million pieces of information. I
Sure.
can't do that. There's no way. I can't control how my filters are processing all of it. No way. The place I can intervene is when my filters create a thought. That's when I can intervene. So instead of a passive conscious process where the filters just create the behavior, I institute an active conscious process. I
Mhm.
check and challenge those filters. Wait
Mhm.
a second. What did my filters just say? What was their judgment of that person? And I challenge it and I assume positive intent on the part of the other person.
Mhm.
And I also assume different from what my filters are telling me. My filters are telling me they were disrespectful. Well, if they had positive intent, they didn't want to be disrespectful. So I've got to assume a different filter
Mhm.
created their behavior.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. But that also requires a lot of self-awareness. That,
Absolutely.
yeah. And so we both know working with, teams, groups, organizations, individuals, we often, we have our own internal bias like, with ourselves. And so sometimes that self-awareness is not really in there. And so
Mhm.
how do you begin that process of
Yeah.
knowing your own?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is the first step
Mhm.
is understanding your own filters. It's not going out and figuring out everybody else and what's going on behind their behaviors. It's understanding how we are controlled by
Mhm.
our filters. All of the behaviors that we think are good and right, we're controlled by them. And so the first step is that self awareness. If I really know how filters work, and then I can identify my filters,
Mhm.
what tend to be my strongest filters that drive how I show up in the world, that drive who I am, that drive my interactions, the more I'm aware of those, the more then I can check the judgment when I perceive that maybe a different filter is involved with others. So it is all about self-awareness first.
Right. Nice, nice. And that's true with most things, right? We have to start with ourselves before we can do any kind of, impactful work. I'll say it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So, in your book, you talked about this creating this equity framework.
Mm-hmm.
So, what does that mean? I mean, we know, you and I both know, just with the work we do, there's this, women have been underrepresented
Yep.
in corporate, government, everywhere,
Yep.
the being at the table for decisions. So what does your equity framework look like, and
Mm-hmm.
what inspired that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, what inspired it was, my work has always been about practical application, research based, but practical.
Nice.
And because I got so tired of folks saying, okay, now we know there's a problem, but what? What do we do? And so, we first created a lot of tools to develop individuals. And, individuals were moving along, and you had a lot of folks in organizations that were developed and understood this, but then how do they use it in organizations? Our equity framework is meant to be used in groups, teams, and organizations as a whole. It essentially is a process that intentionally walks through kind of that active, conscious process, but for groups, teams, and organizations to force us to stop and
Mm,
say, okay, what are our filter driven assumptions as a group? As a team, as an organization, with this policy, with this decision we're about to make, with this practice that we have always utilized. Then, so that first, that's that C self. What and that self here being the organization and our way of looking at the issue. Then see others. Can we see from stakeholders' perspectives how they see the same uh, issue, the
mm,
same policy, how their needs are different,
yeah,
how they have different priorities, how what we see as right may not be what they see is right, and holding all of those up as equally valid.
yeah.
And then also with all of that is considering all kinds of historical context. If our organization has historically done this in a community or with a particular market, what does that mean then for their perspective of us? And then finally, what does all of that mean for our approach in making different decisions in revising this practice, this policy? So those steps then are see self, see others, see approach. And
Love
with a
that.
number of very specific questions to really walk through for the organization to come up with a more equitable and effective decision. And we have clients that utilize that now as it's actually mandated. They have to use that when they make decisions in
Mm.
their organization.
And so that's a great point. So sounds like these organizations are being a bit more progressive. How are the employees embracing or resisting the approach?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that starts with the individual work that's done first.
Okay.
And that individual work, we come with a very much an accessible approach, not it's a no blame, no shame kind of approach, and
Nice.
also a developmental approach. It's
Mhm.
not about good people, bad people, mean people, nice people. It's about stages of development as we develop the skill set and we shift the mindsets that are necessary to be able to see our filters, to be able to be more inclusive, more effective as individuals.
Mhm.
And so that's usually one of the biggest ahas because we start with individuals and we bring them in the very first developmental session. And when they realize, wow, This is about my own effectiveness.
Hmm.
This is about how I'm controlled by my filters. There's a lot more buy-in to the process, to the developmental work with that kind of approach.
Nice, nice. Love to hear that. So, I'm just cognizant of our time, and so this is fascinating work. I love what you're doing because I think that it actually has an impact on so many levels.
Mhm.
Because like I said earlier, we don't know what we don't know, right?
Right.
And until you put the microscope on it, how
Mhm.
can you possibly create any kind of intentional change unless you recognize it?
Mhm.
Um, but I'm curious with regards to, there's this movement from some organizations who had put in DEI practices, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And now there's a little bit of pushback that's happening where, they're saying, oh, it's not worth it, or it hasn't made changes, or see, we were right all along. We didn't need to do this. I'm just curious, Sarah, what are your thoughts on that? And
Mhm.
how do we not lose momentum? Like, because this is
Yeah.
not about a he said, she said, or
Yeah.
us and them. It's how do we have a better world?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of those organizations are approaching the work much like I did 35 years ago. I started out and I was like, okay, where the heck do I start?
Yeah.
And I went out, and that was pre-internet. There may be a lot of listeners that are like, what kind of world is that? Went to the library, did a bunch of research, and I was really looking for, okay, what kind of activities can I do with people? What
Mm,
what can we do? And that's one of the biggest mistakes.
mm,
When we look for what we can do before we look at what developmental stage are we approaching this work from?
mm,
So many organizations approach it from, okay, we need to create ERGs, we need to have a council, we need to do this, we need to do that. And it becomes a checklist. Yet they're still approaching it from a stage of development, a measurable. There are 5 measurable stages of development. And in the first 3, we're not effective
mm,
in checking and challenging our filters. And they're approaching it from one of those first 3 stages. Almost everyone does. And so then what happens is they've got these tractionless transactions working really, really hard, doing what a lot of organizations do. They don't get traction. And so then they say, oh, that just doesn't work. Yet all of the issues are still there.
yeah.
And all of the resources are still there. Diversity is not going away. The reality is our world is becoming more and more diverse.
Mhm,
And so the question is, do we want to develop the mindset, the skill sets, and shift the mindsets so that then we can be more effective in that new world? Or do we want to just keep operating in the old?
mm,
That's really the question. There's no question that our workplace, our organizations are going to be working in diverse environments. So leaders need to say, are we going to create environments that know how to operate with that diversity?
yeah. Yeah, I love that. I love that. I think that's so important. And that's a great way that you've expressed it because it's not going away. We're more global than ever. We're more connected than ever. And
Mhm.
so it's how do you embrace it? And to your point, if we stay in the old, eventually, what is that old saying? If you don't change, you die. So it's like, how do you progress to a
Yes.
new way of thinking or I would say, a more open way of thinking, behaving, and working.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. Yes.
beautiful.
Absolutely. That's what it's all about.
Beautiful. So, Sarah, I'm going to wrap us up. Like, this has been an amazing conversation, and we could probably go on for hours.
Mhm.
Where can people find your book? And just to remind everybody, the name of her latest book is Thinking at the Speed of Bias: How to Shift Our Unconscious Filters. Where can they find that? Where can they find you? Because I'm sure
Mhm.
there's questions. Everybody's going, well, wait. What about
Right,
this?
right. Yeah, Thinking at the Speed of Bias is available wherever you buy your books. Most folks tend to go to Amazon. We've been really pushing for more reviews, so folks are out there want to review. We'd love it. Anywhere you buy your books, and to connect with me, you can go to my company, Deep Sea Consulting, and that's SEE because it's all about how deeply we can observe our filters. So deepseaconsulting.com or on LinkedIn. I'm also on LinkedIn, of course, active there. Sara Taylor on LinkedIn.
Nice, nice. Thank you for that, Sarah. And thank you for taking time with us today. Uh,
Absolutely.
I know there's never enough time to go totally deep into the
Yes.
conversation, but this has been, super thought provoking. And I hope any of our people that are listening share this with your organizations because
Hmm.
I hear a lot about the checklist, right? Oh, our company's just going through the motions. And oftentimes that's not intentional, but
Yeah.
maybe talk to them about why that happens, why we
Yeah.
get into this, this habit of just checking off. So thank
Hmm.
you so much for sharing with us today, and congratulations again on your new book. Um,
Thank you.
Super exciting, and I'm sure it's going to go right up to one of the top bestsellers. So congratulations to you.
Thank you so much, Vicki. Again, thank you for the opportunity. And to the listeners, thank you as well.
Well, we appreciate you being here. And so let me take a moment and thank our listeners. Absolutely. We couldn't do this without you. We wouldn't continue without you. September goes into our third year of running this podcast. And so thank you for making that possible and being part of it. Like I said, do share this episode with your employer, with anybody who is looking to open their minds and hearts more broadly. I think that's also an important to start with yourself. And if you're, looking for some resources to help you, you can visit our Women in Leadership Empowered website, and you'll find 2 free mini webinars that you can do on that site. One is about how to embrace fear, and the other is about changing habits. So go in our website, check that out, and you'll get some really valuable content. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. We're super grateful to you, and we'll see you on the next Women in Leadership Talk podcast. Take care, everyone.